right.
Okay. Good evening to all the participants present here for the 3-day workshop on academic writing, organized by Tibeto-Burman Linguistics Association of Northeast India. And today our speaker is Dr. Kellen Parker Van Dam from the University of Zurich and Latrobe University, Australia. So I would like to announce the session open. And before we begin, I'd like to introduce our chairperson, Dr. Flouting, who is also the president of Tibeto. And I'd like to request our president, Dr. Haukip, to also give a keynote address before he chairs the session. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. With all those struggles, we are now ready to start our program. So we are led by 8 minutes, and we apologize for those technical glitch. So I welcome everyone present here. So altogether, we have near about 26 attendees for this program, which is a big number, comparing the size of our group. So at the outset, I take this privilege to thank our first speaker, Kellen Parker Van Dam. So he has been very much part of our group, and he has been helping us whenever we need. And today he has agreed to give us the first talk on academic writing. So thus far, we have been confined only to linguistics of Northeast India, and particularly what we call Tibeto-Burman linguistics of Northeast India. By now, after a series of workshop, talks, and deliberations, so we are now ready to diversify our our platform to new areas such as academic writings. So when this idea was discussed in our core group, so we had a hard time locating the right speaker who can really enlighten us in academic writings. So academic writing is one of the areas which many of our participants wanted to have a talk on, because it concerns every aspiring academician, scholars, and our entire group. So we are not particularly very fluent with academic writing. So whatever we know has to be written, and they have to be disseminated to the outside world. And there are standards, procedures to be followed. And unless we meet those procedures, sometimes our academic writing may not be accepted. So we are very lucky to have amidst us our none other than our own friend. We call him by his name. We call him Kellen. So Kellen Parker. He will be delivering to us the first series, the first talk in this series. So without much delay, because we're running behind the time, I welcome Dr. Kellen. And the topic that he's going to present to us is the Cooperative Principle and Academic Writing, Grice, Maxims as a tool for authors. So with these few words, I would like to welcome, if there is no other information from the secretary, I would like to welcome our speaker for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, hopefully that's working. I do want to add one quick point, which is, as this is about academic writing and not specifically about language documentation, of course, this is true. Much of what I'm going to talk about today is still focused on this idea of presenting the information that we as linguists in the Northeast are going to be presenting, but the topics that I will discuss really do have more widespread application than just this. So if I could start by expanding on the introduction just a little bit to give a little bit of background on myself and sort of what my background is that is relevant to this topic. I'm currently based at the University of Zurich, where in addition to my research responsibilities dealing with Sino-Tibetan and Thai languages of the Northeast, I teach 2 undergrads here at the University of Zurich, and I teach the undergraduate scientific writing course in the Department of Linguistics. I'm also part of the department at La Trobe University in Australia, as you see, where I'm involved in graduate thesis advising. I'm also part of the editorial board of Languages and Peoples of the Eastern Himalayan Region, which is part of Himalayan Linguistics. This is the journal that was formerly the Journal of the Northeast Indian Linguistics Society, but with a change of publisher, we have a change of name as well. And finally, I'm a regular reviewer for other journals covering the region, many of which you either have possibly submitted to in the past or will at some point, things like LTBA and HL and so on. All of this to say, I've seen a lot of writing, much of it to do with the Northeast over the years, and from authors from a really wide range of academic backgrounds and trainings. Today is going to be something of a combination of writing, guidance, hints kind of thing, and sociolinguistics, which will hopefully make sense by the end of it. One last note before I get started, I'd like to apologize if I end up having to stop, to pause, to cough briefly. I recently recovered from COVID, but the cough has decided that it's going to stick around. So apologies in advance if that happens. So let's begin. For a lot of people who are seeking to be a better writer, you'll hear a lot of suggestions of practices that you can employ. These are things like outlining your ideas before you begin writing any prose. This is a great idea in general. Don't write your introduction until you've actually finished the body of the paper. Again, this is a great idea. These are all good suggestions, and that they're ones you should attempt to follow. These, however, are what I would consider procedural guidelines. They relate to the process of the writing. Today, what I would like to talk about instead is what I would consider conceptual guidelines. These are more things which are less to do with getting the words on the page and more to do with making sure those words are something that the reader will be able to easily and enjoyably engage with. It's not always enough just to say the thing, but you also have to try to say it well. So with this in mind, I'd like to introduce to you, to those of you who are not familiar with it already, a thing called the Cooperative Principle. The Cooperative Principle was an idea by an English philosopher of language, H. Paul Grice. He passed away in the late 80s, if I'm not mistaken. If you've taken any classes on discourse analysis, sociolinguistics, introductory linguistics courses, you may already be familiar with this idea. But for those of you who aren't, the main point is that language, whether it is written or spoken, is fundamentally a social act. We are, as part of that, social actors, right? My own students would be sick to death of hearing me say this one more time because I tell them all the time in class, but this is just a truth of human communication. The speaker and the listener are engaged in a relationship of cooperation. Again, as I said, it's not enough to put the words on the paper, but also you have to figure out the best way to do that. As speakers, but also as writers, we have to consider how the audience is going to receive that information and how they may be reading between the lines or what they may be missing by not reading in between the lines. For Grice, the person who came up with the cooperative principle, to describe this in detail, he outlined a series of maxims, which serve as guidelines for both production and for analysis of communication. I should say these are often referred to by 2 different names, Grice's maxims, with the possessive, and also Gricean maxims as an adjective. I personally learned the latter, but I'm probably going to be using these 2 names interchangeably. They refer to the same thing. If you decide to look into this further after this talk, you might have to search for both names to get the full range of results. Specifically, Grice outlined 4 maxims. Each of these has a clarifying description, which we'll get into detail in shortly. Again, if you studied other linguistics courses, this may be something that you've run into. But if not, then what these maxims are ideas through which we can better understand why and how miscommunication happens, but also how we can understand things like sarcasm or irony or other kind of ways of increasing the variety and sort of different ways that we can go about saying things. This is as an analytical tool. But as authors, these also provide an excellent guide for clear communication and writing. They offer a great way that we can ensure reviewers as well, because anybody who is publishing in peer-reviewed journals, reviewers are people that you're going to have to deal with, of course. This helps us ensure that reviewers of our work have fewer things to criticize when we're trying to get our research published. As an author, I personally dread reviewer comments. It's always a little bit nerve-wracking, but it's important to remind ourselves that this is not personal. The comments, that is. It's not that anyone on the reviewing or editing side of things is out to get you personally, since, as you know, the process is supposed to be anonymous anyway. And it's also not the case that they're looking for excuses to reject your work. That's certainly not the case, and in fact is quite the opposite. People with established careers in the region, at least those who I have personally worked with, sincerely want to see more research coming out of the languages of the Northeast from people who know those languages best. This is so much the case, this attitude, that you could almost call this something like a mission statement of journals like the ones that I work on. Everyone in the community, everyone in the linguistics community, but also people in the Northeast in general, benefit from these kinds of publications. However, it is the reviewer's job to make sure that the research coming out is up to some kind of international standard, as we just heard in the keynote speech. Standards will vary from journal to journal, but the general trend in recent years has been a move towards higher standards across the board. Thus, it is probably more difficult today to get published in a journal like LTBA than it was to get published in LTBA 10 years ago. This is just kind of a general trend that has been happening, at least in the sort of Northeast and adjacent regions. With that in mind, if your data and your conclusions are good, but your explanation is unclear, then that creates more work for you, but also for everyone else involved in the publication process. If everything is really clear, however, then the reviewers can focus more strictly on the data and conclusions, and you're more likely to get published in more outlets as a result. A big focus of the class that I teach here in Zurich is how to navigate this publication process, right? And it's a writing class, but it really has a big focus on dealing with this kind of issue. So that's sort of where the focus will be today. So with that in mind, let's go over Grice's 4 maxims, starting with the first one, which is known as the Maxim of Quantity. As I said, each of these maxims can be split into sort of sub-maxims, they're called. Not a very good name, but that's just what people call them. So these sub-maxims serve to clarify and expand on the main idea. In the case of the Maxim of Quality, the sub-maxims are basically say enough and don't say too much. Fine. A lot of these sub-maxims are in this kind of format where it gives some descriptive sentence and then says, also don't do the opposite thing. That seems like maybe that's a little intuitive and kind of silly to spell it out, but you'll see why. The idea here is that you're looking to find the sweet spot in between these two extremes. In the case of the Maxim of Quantity, it is often the word limits of the journal which give you this guidance, right? So if you are told, for example, that you must have between 5,000 and 10,000 words, just made up numbers, that's kind of long for a lot of journal papers, but let's say 5,000 to 10,000 words, and you only have 2,000 words of things to say, then it might just be the case that you shouldn't submit that particular paper to that particular journal. Or it means that you need to expand the scope of your paper so that you can comfortably fit that word limit with the things that are relevant to what you want to say. However, what you should avoid is things like filler, right? You don't want to just sort of fill it up so that you have 5,000 words, even if you only have 2,000 words to say. That's a problem. Hopefully everybody knows that, but it's worth saying. Aside from filler, the bigger issue is predicting what the audience knows. So in my own writing, for example, I often, unintentionally, but it happens, I often assume that the reader has more background knowledge than they actually do. As an example, I have a background in Chinese linguistics before I started working in the Northeast, and sometimes unconsciously, I assume that everyone else working on any Sino-Tibetan languages will also have this kind of understanding of how Chinese linguists, not linguists from China, but those working on Chinese, have approached certain topics. And so a lot of times I might use vocabulary or jargon that's very specific to that particular tradition. So in this case, I am violating the Maxim of Quantity because I'm not giving enough information to communicate my ideas clearly. Again, there's a sweet spot between too much and too little, and part of the issue with this in your own writing is going to just be trying to find this spot and figure out how it works nicely for the data that you want to present, right? While this can be difficult to find this sweet spot, 100% this is something that reviewers are going to comment on. If you submit a paper and you fail to define something well, or you fail to give enough background information, or you're giving far too much, then they're probably going to tell you you need to fix that. So let's look at a little bit of an example. Imagine I am writing a paper on this language called Zürich. Okay, it's an introductory passage for a hypothetical paper on the German dialect spoken here in Zurich. So the first example sentence we have is, Zürich is a language variety belonging to the High Alemannic branch of Alemannic, which in turn is part of the Upper German branch of High German within the West Germanic family of Germanic languages under Indo-Germanic, which just means Indo-European, but here in German-speaking countries, Indo-European is called Indo-Germanic. So that's question number one, or sentence number one. The second option, Zürich is the High Alemannic variety of German spoken in and around the city of Zurich, Switzerland. Hopefully everybody sees the second one is quite a bit better. Why, right? Well, we can generally assume that things like broad strokes language classification is something that readers of linguistics papers will already know, or at the very least, they'll be able to have the means to go look it up. You can assume that if you are writing a paper on hierarchical verb marking in such and such Tibeto-Burman language of Arunachal Pradesh, no one who doesn't have at least a basic understanding of language families is likely to pick up that paper, right? So we can make some kinds of assumptions about this. You personally may not be familiar. In this case, in my example case, you personally may not be familiar with all of the classification of Germanic dialects. I certainly wasn't before I moved to a German-speaking country. But the second sentence, the second example, should still be more than enough for you to get a general idea. You've heard of German. You probably know German is an Indo-European language. Cool, right? The other nice thing is that in the case of language varieties which have a code on glottolog, this is the ZURI 1239 thing that you see in both of these sentences. This is kind of a universal identifying code for languages. This is something that is on glottolog.org. There's the link in the bottom right if you're interested. Including these kinds of codes for languages which have them, and not all of your languages will have one yet. They can be added. That's another question. Email me later for more on that. If you include that, then that's great, because if I see this four-letter, four-number code, I know exactly where to go. I can look it up. I can see the whole family tree of the language. And then you as a writer don't have to try to figure out how much of this information is too much, right? As a side note, I do recommend everybody here familiarize yourself with glottolog. It's an ever-evolving classification. It's fantastic. It's replacing ethnologue. Have a look. That's an aside. That's not about writing. Just generally good to know. So that's the first maxim. That's the maxim of quantity. Let's move on to the maxim of quality. This is the second. And I think the maxim of quality is what I personally believe is probably the most important, at least for the kind of writing that I tend to see as an editor, as a reviewer, the kind of literature that I see coming out of a lot of journals. This may be the one that is most important, especially for dealing with previously undocumented or underdocumented language varieties. The maxim of quality, I keep trying to say maximum, the maxim of quality, there we go. Unlike a lot of these maxims, this relates to how you say things. Most of them do, but this one is specifically on what you say. I'll clarify that in a second. As I said, most of us are working on languages with either poor documentation, very little published literature, sometimes conflicting published literature. I'm sure you've encountered this. Or languages for which the only real data has been gathered in the course of our own work, right? And so for this reason, the maximum of quality might be the most important, and it is the one of the four that I probably will spend the most time on. So let's look into this. The maximum of quality. Put simply, the maximum of quality says you should only say what you know to be truthful, and you should not say something for which you have no evidence. And importantly, hearsay is not evidence, right? So let's look at a few examples. We have four altogether. These are not from any specific paper. I want to be very clear. None of the examples that I'm giving are from real papers that I've looked at. So if any of you have submitted papers to journals where I've been a reviewer, I promise these are not from your paper. These are made up, but they are representative of the kind of things that we see a lot in these sorts of papers. So the first one, blank. So some community, whatever your community is, are the most unique community among the scheduled tribes of India. This kind of sentence, right? The Dimasa, for example, are the most unique community among the scheduled tribes of India. This kind of sentence, this kind of superlative wording shows up quite a lot in these papers. So, right, let's say that you put this in your paper. how are you quantifying that? What is the basis for such a measure? It may be true that the community about which you are writing is truly quite distinct from some idea of Central Indian culture or language, or Northern, I guess, Central, I mean, in this case, or it's incredibly different from other languages that immediately surround it. Maybe it is a Thai language surrounded by Tibeto-Burman languages, for example. But again, how are you quantifying that? Have you done a large-scale study of ethno-linguistic features of languages of the Northeast? Almost certainly not. If anyone has, publish it. I'd love to see it, but chances are you haven't done this, right? Instead, without using sensationalist language of superlatives, what you can do is just enumerate some of the features that you think that readers would find interesting in a Northeastern context. I assume everybody here is generally working on languages of the Northeast, just given the venue that this is. If you're not in the Northeast, if you're working somewhere else, this also applies to you, but think of this in a regional context. There are certain features that languages of the Northeast will tend to have. Having something like numeral classifiers, not a crazy thing for the Northeast. Now, well, that's probably a bad example because Assamese also has these, but this is not something that Indian languages otherwise generally do. Indo-Aryan languages don't have this, for example. So if this is something that really you feel the language you're working on has, but none of the neighbor languages do, okay, cool. Then you have something specific that you can point to rather than simply saying this is the most unique. I assume we're doing questions at the end, so hopefully all of this makes sense. If anything doesn't make sense, write it down and we'll talk about it at the end. Okay, another example. Language X is spoken in Tinsukia district and South Korea. I have seen people write things like this. You may have heard this yourself from one of your consultants for the languages that you work on. I've heard this for a bunch of different languages, not about South Korea specifically, but something where it's a little bit far, right? Some other country that they have speakers here, as well as somewhere else that to you is unbelievably far away. This could come about for many reasons, this idea, and maybe it's true. Maybe there actually is a diaspora community for this language. There are a lot of languages that have considerable diaspora communities in parts of the world you would never imagine. Most of you may have heard of the language Hmong. Hmong is a language, it's part of the Hmong-Mien language family in Southeast Asia. Hmong is spoken throughout Southeast Asia and in La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is a small town in the United States not far from where I was born. This would seem like a crazy statement to make if you didn't know about the diaspora due to the war in the 70s and 60s, right? So there may be validity to this. I want to be very clear. For all of these examples that I'm giving, they may be true, but if you haven't done the work to verify it, then you should not simply regurgitate this sentence as a fact, right? Instead, you should look into it and see what you can find out. Again, it may be true, but then that is on you to determine whether or not that is the case, because otherwise you're violating the Maxim of Quality. This community fought against the Shan in 1328 CE or AD. Again, this very well may have happened. I personally wasn't there. I assume neither of you were there, unless you're hiding some Marvel movie superhero secret for many centuries. Again, talk to me afterwards if that's the case. This may be true, but you still have to do something to try to verify it, or you have to report it as the tradition states, right? If you just present this thing as fact without any evidence, then a reader might come to read this and think, oh, well, this person is just lying because clearly that didn't happen in 1328. It happened in 1382 or something like this, right? There are a lot of identical narratives which are common across communities in the Northeast, even between unrelated language communities, indicating that oral tradition might have transferred rather than these really were one community that split. Fighting against the Shan is one of those things that everybody, at least on my side of Arunachal, it seems everybody has this kind of narrative. Again, it may be completely true, but if you presented it as fact without some sort of evidence, then that becomes a problem for you as an author. So what you need to do then is either cite a reputable history book, which supports the idea, or you present it as tradition, because there may not be any, because a lot of times people back then who were writing the books honestly didn't care much about a lot of the areas that we work in. So in that case, tradition holds. Hopefully that makes sense. The last one for the maxim of quality is, this is one I want to be a little bit careful about because it's one that I hear quite often, but it's also one that is likely rooted in historical and modern racism, which is why I want to be careful about it. I'm sure many of you have seen this word mongoloid used to describe people in the Northeast. This is a very outdated concept of race going all the way back to the 1780s. In America and in England, and therefore in a lot of international publications, this term is incredibly racist and derogatory. And like personally as an editor, I would never be okay with a paper referring to people as mongoloid. It's outdated in a really bad way. It's bad science, it's racist. Same goes for using yellow as a descriptor of race. So this is sort of, I'm sorry, but American English and English tend to rule international publication discourse. Black and white are acceptable terms for racial descriptions. Yellow is considered unacceptable and racist. So something to be avoided. Also, this issue with mongoloid is that it's been used by a lot of authors outside of the Northeast to describe people in the Northeast, and they may be well-meaning, these authors, and just ignorant of the history of the term, but it's one you should avoid. The point for the maximum of quality here is because of the popularity of this term, that was a little bit of an aside, but we're coming back, is that in a lot of Indian literature, the traditional narrative has shifted. So, because it is used in a lot of Indian literature, the narrative that people give in these communities and Tibeto-Burman speaking communities has shifted. So whereas before, if you go talk to a bunch of 70 and 80-year-old community members, they might give a traditional migration story of we settled here, we came from South China, we came from Myanmar, we came from Tibet, we came from somewhere else, right, in that general area. But now, if you talk to a lot of younger people, you will hear them say things like, we migrated from Mongolia because of this term mongoloid. Now, again, it is potentially possible that this has happened. I don't think there's any linguistic, genetic, archaeological support for this idea, but it is possible that it could have happened. However, as scholars, we cannot simply take this at face value. Instead, we have to sort of present it in a way where, since we don't know it to be verified fact, we are making sure we are not exposing ourselves to criticism for something that may be a community idea that science would find difficult or problematic, right? Additionally, if you say immigrated from China or migrated from if you say migrated from China or migrated from Myanmar, it depends on when this happened, but you might want to say something like the area which is today southern China, because unless the migration happened after 1949, China, as we know it, was not a country, and therefore the phrasing, this is kind of a subtle thing, but the phrasing is different, right? To be very clear, I'm not questioning anybody's traditional migration narratives. Again, if this is the actual migration narrative that a community has, then you report it as such. You just have to make sure that you are presenting it as they say blah, 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 or elders of the community tell the traditional narrative as such and such and such. This is true for everything. This is not just true for migration narratives, but this is true for anything. You will find community members who are going to say things that contradict anything you would find in a history book or elsewhere. You have reported speech. And we'll get into a little bit of how to deal with some of these things shortly. Actually, shortly right now. So how do we get around these issues? The easiest way to deal with statements from community members or things in your research that, I guess it's still community members, but things that might contradict history books or science or genetics or whatever else, is simply reported speech. Among speakers of such and such community, for example, tradition holds that blah, 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 blah. Or you say speakers report, right? Blah, 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 blah. Although there's no evidence that I've been able to find, you can choose how much you want to sort of hedge that. You can also just say contradictory narratives exist. This is something I deal with a lot. One of my main focuses is I want to try to reconstruct the history and give back sort of the agency to the people of the region. But a lot of times you have people in this village, and they completely contradict each other, even though they're the same community, in which case you just say contradictory narratives exist, right? It's not necessarily your job as a linguist to pick a side in that, but simply to present the information as it's given to you. Traditional knowledge is incredibly important, as you know. you just also want to make sure that you are not presenting something as truth without at least attempting to verify the claims. Or if it is simply traditional knowledge, you report it as such. You present it as traditional knowledge, and no one's going to have a problem with that. Again, in the back of your mind, as you're writing, you should always be thinking, what is some reviewer going to say about what I'm putting out here? And what can I do to circumvent that kind of criticism or that kind of comment? So this is sort of the mindset that I'm coming at this from. I also want to point out that this kind of issue is different than reporting purely linguistic data. So you don't need to be verifying every single thing that you hear from every community member with every other community member. Nobody has time for that. It is good to confirm your data, of course, but things that have to do with history or any of the other examples that I've given, it's good whenever you can to try to confirm it, because after all, we are scientists, right? Maybe we are social scientists in many cases, maybe we're hard scientists elsewhere, but we are still scientists, so we have to at least make an effort to achieve scientific standards at an international level. The other important workaround is just simply to cite the data. So as an example, the actual relationship within Sino-Tibetan of all of the different languages, or Tibeto-Burman as it's also called, or Trans-Himalayan as it's also called, all of these internal relationships are not yet agreed upon. We were not there yet, probably 20 years before we have a good idea. Even the name of the family is not well agreed upon, as I mentioned. However, any paper you write, you're going to have to say, here's how my language fits into this. So what you end up having to do is just find some piece of literature, follow that literature, cite that literature, and then wash your hands of the whole issue. I personally don't care what we call the language family. To me, this is something that does not matter whatsoever to me, but you have to call it something. So I just say Sino-Tibetan because that's the old name, and I don't have to worry about defending it. I don't have to cite anybody by doing that. If you prefer Trans-Himalayan, for example, then you just cite Georg van Driem and move on, and then you don't have to worry about it. Citation is an excellent way to prevent criticism or accusations of plagiarism, which are also a really big deal. And of course, with everything else, you want to prioritize recent publications. So do not cite a book from 1897 as your source for how a language is classified. It will be wrong. Ideas have developed considerably. It's always best to find the sort of things within the last 10, 15 years. And this does not only apply to language classification, but to a whole number of things. Recency of your citations is always better when possible. Okay, so just to review for this maxim, say what you know to be true. Don't say what you don't have evidence for. Easy as that. Moving on to the third maxim, this is the maxim of relation. It's really quite simple, just be relevant. So here's another example. Zürichdeutsch is the Alemannic variety of German spoken in and around the city of Zurich, Switzerland, at an altitude of approximately 408 meters, with a temperate alpine climate and an average rainfall of 1,115 millimeters per year. Doesn't matter, not relevant. Unless you're writing about how altitude and rainfall are dealt in the language community, it is not relevant at all. Don't include information just for the sake of including it, but stick to your topic. Just because you haven't hit the word limit, it does not mean you should add filler. And of course, this does have some overlap with the Maxim of Quantity that we've already discussed. That's an easy one. The final of Grice's maxims is the Maxim of Manner. This one really is just be clear. So what this means is clarity both in terms of how you're putting sentences together, but also in terms of how you move from one sentence to another. And that's what's meant by this be orderly, the fourth point here. The other thing is point 3 is kind of relevant. Hopefully point 1 and 2 are really clear. And so we're not going to spend a lot of time on those. What I mean by dictionary English in point 3, though, that's not Grice's wording. That's my own wording of this. But this is a strategy employed both by native English speaking students as well as L2 English speakers, where it ends up in the end paper looking like you've just used a thesaurus or dictionary to find a fancier way to say almost every word in the sentence, sometimes because that's actually exactly what you did. It's not a good practice. It makes it harder to read, and there's a really good chance you're going to misuse the words anyway. So stick to vocabulary you know. Even if you do not believe you have a tremendously big vocabulary, it doesn't matter. It's better to say things directly and clearly and be confident of the word choices you're using. So, okay, so some real world examples. First, do not use acronyms unless you've defined them first. So for example, we might say Northeast India, and then in parentheses, NEI, after which point we can then use NEI throughout the paper because we've already defined it once, right? But not before first saying Northeast India. At the end of the paper, a lot of people are familiar with this. There might be a table of abbreviations. That table should not be the first time that the reader has seen what this word, this acronym actually stands for. The same goes for ideas and concepts. The very first time you introduce a concept, unless it is truly common knowledge, that first time it should get defined. You also want to avoid referring to tables, figures in very vague terms, such as the table below. A lot of people do this. I used to do this all the time. I would say in the following table. The problem is that the formatting of the paper might change between when you write the paper and when it gets published. So you always want to refer to tables, figures, examples, sections, chapters by number. They should generally be numbered. If you have a journal you're submitting to where their style sheet does not have numbered anything, numbered sections, some journals won't do. So instead, what you say in the section on verbal morphology, for example, and refer to the section by the topic of that section if there are no numbers, but otherwise give the numbers, always give the numbers. And then for the final point for the Maxim of Manner is this idea of signposting. So signposting really just refers to giving some indication of what following sections will be about. And this could be a paragraph in the introduction for, like, if it's a very long paper, you might have one paragraph in the introduction that goes over in this section, I'll do this. In this section, I'll do this. In the next section after that, I'll do this, right? But it can also just be a sentence at the end of one section, which leads into the next one. If the paper is incredibly short, you don't need to do this at all. You just want to make sure that the ideas flow together in an intuitive way. One of the things that personally drives me crazy is really short papers that have a whole paragraph on signposting, because then it just feels like filler. And again, thanks to the Maxim of Quantity, we know filler is something to be avoided, right? So signposting is great. Use it appropriately for the length of the paper that you're writing. The best option, if you don't know what to do in this, is you're just going to put transition sentences as the last sentence in each major section. That sort of introduces what the next one will be about. Okay, this next point is not actually about writing. I apologize for that, but it's something that's really useful to mention because this has already kind of been a crash course on Gricean maxims. This is an idea called flouting the maxims. We only have one slide on this. We're not going to spend a lot of time, but this really just means intentionally violating these 4 rules that I've given you. You can break these rules on purpose, and sarcasm is an example of breaking these rules. Irony is another example of breaking these, not breaking exactly, but flouting these rules, generally of quality. This isn't something you're likely to be doing in your writing, I would hope. But since this is also a general overview, it's worth mentioning. And you may have wondered already, well, doesn't sarcasm break this? Doesn't irony break this? Maybe you've been wondering this, maybe you haven't. So flouting the maxims is a big feature of Grice's cooperative principle. Generally speaking, in an academic paper, you are not going to be using sarcasm or irony, but there it is. It's good to know in general. So why does this matter? We've touched on this a little bit, but it's worth a bit of a review. First, no one likes getting bad reviewer comments, but it does happen. Nobody likes having a paper rejected, but this also happens. However, by following these maxims in your writing, the prose is generally going to be much clearer, which means that your reviewers have more time to focus on the actual data and claims, because really nothing is worse than getting a paper rejected simply due to a lack of clarity when you personally know as the author that the data and the results are excellent. This also makes it easier for the editors to work with you on improving the paper, because then they also get to focus on the things that really matter rather than just telling you be more clear, be less verbose, be better here, do less of this kind of stuff, right? And I say this speaking with experience as an editor, but as an author, and the comments that I often get, because often I too forget to apply some of these things consistently. So this happens to everybody. Now, and I'm very sorry to do this, but since Grice named Maxims after himself, I think it's only fair that I get to do the same. So I present to you 4 very brief Van Damme's Maxims. These are also things that I think are really useful for people to know when writing papers. They just help things go so much smoother and are generally good things to keep in mind. So The first one, be current. This kind of relates to some stuff we've talked about, but the main idea is don't use outdated terminology. This can be things like very old-fashioned colonialist language, like we've already talked about, but it could just be something like an outdated language family tree. Some of the really old Sino-Tibetan language classifications included Thai languages and included Hmong under Sino-Tibetan. Nobody thinks this anymore except for some scholars in China. You want to look at recent publications from large international journals or international universities, see how they are describing the subject, see what kind of vocabulary they are using, and you want to follow that. Because if you're using something really outdated, the reviewer might take it the wrong way. They might think that you're trying to push some agenda that you don't have, when really you're just trying to get your results out there. Number two, be intentional. This really just means have a point. What is it that you're trying to say with this paper? Why should we as readers be interested? What is novel about the publication, right? You should not write a paper just to get a publication, as tempting as that may be. I get it. I've been in that situation where you just need publications. And so you're going to just start coming up with things to write, right? You want to make sure you're actually saying something new. If you are, for example, comparing different things like different structures within one language or one structure between different languages, why did you choose those structures for comparison? Why did you choose those languages for comparison? What is it about them? Are they all in the same family? Do they both show the same structure despite not being in the same family? What is the relevant information that your comparison is giving to us as the readers? You never want to leave a reader wondering, why did they write this? Or why is this paragraph here, right? Some of this just goes into making sure your ideas flow nicely together. But in general, you just want to make sure that there really is a purpose for this paper being written. And no, I need 5 publications so my advisor is happy doesn't count as a good enough reason when we're talking about the journal and the reader's side of things. You may need 5 publications or whatever it may be, but we need to make sure that we're being intentional. Number 3, be transparent. Generally, this is always good advice, but in the case of academic publishing, if you are not transparent, if you're hiding something, readers will notice and they will hold it against you. If you have an agenda, readers will notice and they will hold it against you. This can be taken as an extension of the Maxim of Quantity, as well as quality/truth, but you just want to make sure that you're really clear. If you have example sentences in your paper, you should specify, is this an elicited sentence? Did I specifically say to the speaker with my microphone in hand, how do you say blah, 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 whatever it is? Or was this sentence coming out of some traditional story that I heard them tell, or something I heard them say and then had them clarify? That seems like it might be unnecessary. It might be a lot of work, but that's exactly the kind of stuff you want, because elicited sentences get you different stuff than naturally spoken sentences. So be transparent. You don't have to go crazy. You don't have to talk about what the temperature was that day and how it might have affected the microphone. Again, that's too much, maxim of quantity, but you get the idea. And the fourth and final of my maxims, this is probably the most important one of the ones that I have added, is to be receptive. Be receptive to reviewer and editor comments, as well as those that you get after conference talks. As you know, conferences are a fantastic place to get feedback before you write the paper. Take those comments to heart. They may have an unfriendly tone. I've gotten reviewer comments where I think, man, what is wrong with this person? Why do they hate me? They don't even know me, right? They don't probably mean anything by it. Maybe they just have poor social skills, or they were having a bad day that day, or I was the 7th paper that they had to read and they were already sick of it. Doesn't matter. In general, those people are there to help, not attack. So try to read the content and don't worry so much about the tone. Almost certainly, especially if you are a native speaker of the language that you are working on, you probably know a lot more about your language than they do. But they will always have some point or some level or some specialty of expertise that you will lack. And they'll also be able to catch issues in your writing that you yourself would miss, because the more you look at your own paper, I'm sure everybody here has experienced this, after the 8th hour of working on your paper, you've almost forgotten what's in there. You're blind to the issues because you've spent too much time working on it. So an extra set of eyes can always help. Again, this also goes for comments you might get after a talk. Yes, you are the expert on your language, but you can't know everything. And often comments from the old white European guy will be the thing to make a good paper into an excellent paper. So as an example, I'm a native English speaker. I think I speak English fairly well most days, but I would not do a good job of describing a syntax. I just wouldn't. I don't have training in English syntax. I have training in Chinese syntax, right? My native speaker intuition is excellent. Well, it's not as excellent anymore because I've lived abroad for too long, but still pretty good. Some old professor's ideas on the syntactic descriptions of whatever it is that I'm saying are going to be better, even if they themselves don't fluently speak English. Because if they are someone who has really studied syntax and looked at all of these different ways that, let's say, West Germanic languages like English do things, then they're going to be able to address stuff. Put another way, if you're at a conference and someone like Jim Matisoff or Scott Delancey is giving you feedback after a talk, listen to them, even if you decide to disagree with them in the end. You do not have to implement all of the all of the comments that you get, but you should at least be receptive to consider them because they really can make the difference between a pretty good paper and an excellent paper. So that's it. Thank you very much. I would love to discuss this if people have questions. I'm sure we have plenty of time. I'm not sure if I should stop sharing or not.
Okay. Yeah, you can give your slides.
Yep.
So, thank you, Kellen, for that wonderful presentation, taking us into the forest of Grice Maxim, 4 Maxims, and with illustrative example, basically from different areas of linguistics. So now we have lots of time for comments, suggestion, question. So I would request the audience to feel free and clear your doubt wherever you have the doubt. So don't keep it to yourself. So just ask the expert who is before us. So now the floor is open for questions and comments.
And I apologize for going a little fast, but please do ask because there's a lot to be discussed on all of these.
Okay, just to break the ice. So just before others prepare their question. So I would like to say something about one the receptive things that you talk about.
Yes.
So most of the time as authors, we try to be very receptive to whatever the comments that we get from reviewers or from learned or senior so-called scholars in conferences.
Right.
Now the question is that in trying to be too receptive to them, perhaps without fully understanding their their suggestions. So just being trying to be so receptive and trying to be so faithful, you may end up missing some of the points that they might be intending to say. Sure. And what you are trying to incorporate it. So there are dangers here and there, and it's a tie-rope kind of work. So we face this most of the time. So I just want you to elaborate from your experience.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I try really hard as a reviewer to be very explicit. I won't say who it is, but there is a European specialist in Sino-Tibetan languages who is one of the best people you can ever get as a reviewer, because they will give you exact citations for every paper with page numbers for every comment that they leave. And it's fantastic. And I try really hard to be as thorough as this person and in trying to help the authors to track down the right citation and things like this. You will get reviewers who are just like, yeah, this is good enough. Or they'll say, I don't like this, but they don't really give you a good reason why, right? Like authors, reviewers also vary wildly in quality and in clarity. When I say be receptive, I guess the most important part of this is I've gone to conferences all over the world where someone will give a presentation and someone in the audience will offer a suggestion or a comment, and the speaker won't even acknowledge it. They'll acknowledge it, but they won't go any further. When in reality, just by spending half an hour sometime when they get back from the conference considering these issues really could have helped them clarify what they're trying to say, or it would improve their analysis or whatever. You do not need to incorporate everything that a conference commenter is going to tell you, right? You absolutely don't. You may evaluate what they say and decide, actually, this doesn't really fit in with my topic, or the thing that they want me to include. This goes for journal reviewers as well. You might say the thing they want me to include, it doesn't make sense to me, or I don't feel like I know enough about this topic to include it. Then you just tell the editor and you say, look, I get it. They want me to add this. I lack the expertise to do this, or they want me to do this, but I think they're wrong. Your editor is your best friend in those situations. The editor will help you navigate. If you have a good editor, because again, editors vary in quality, but your editor's job is to help you negotiate those kinds of issues. And I've gone back to my own editors and said, the reviewer wanted me to cite a paper that I think is garbage, and I refuse to cite it. And I've told the editor this, right? And the editor says, okay, fine. I trust your judgment on that. You don't have to cite it, right? Or the editor will come back and say, okay, I get it, but you still have to cite it because it is relevant to your topic, even if you don't agree with it. So just mention it in a citation and move on. Communicate with your editors in those cases if you don't know what to do with the reviewer comments, or if you feel like you're getting bogged down, if you're getting too drowning in their comments, right? I hope that addresses sort of what you were saying.
Exactly.
Yeah, your editor is your friend, and I really wish, I say this to my coworkers as well, because I have a number of coworkers, or just other people I know who are linguists who work in the Northeast, who are sort of early in their careers. I mean, I'm also early in my career, but they'll be like, I have this paper and I don't really know what to do with this because the reviewer wants this, and I don't think that's reasonable. And I say to them, always talk to the editor. That's the editor's job. And a lot of times people are kind of surprised because I don't know that everybody really realizes as an editor, that's a big thing that we are there to help you with. So really you should reach out to them and communicate with them. And they really should be quite helpful. Maybe I'm biased. Maybe I've only had really good editors in the past, but yeah, they've always been really receptive to helping you navigate some of these issues. So you are not alone in the process of publication.
Please ask questions.
I beg you. What kind of issues in general? So whether it's for the writing process or the publication process, for those of you who have put together papers that you either have submitted or hope to submit, what has been the most difficult part of that process for you? I think nobody is feeling brave today. Unfortunately, I can't see names.
Yeah,
because
there is a question in the chat box.
Great. Okay. Oh, there it is. Sorry, I lost my chat while I was sharing. Yeah. Okay. So I'll read this. In cases of contradictory narratives from different consultants, how do we address those? That is a really good question. It happens to me often. There are a couple different ways that you can approach this. The most hands-off way that you can do this is simply say, one person told me this, a different person told me this. The problem is you also should expect that whatever you're writing, community members will eventually read, right? Ideally, at least I personally think that everything that we are publishing on Languages of the Northeast should be available to the communities that it is about, right? It is their data. It is their language. It's not ours as linguists. They have just given us access to it. So you should expect that they will read what you write. I have run into cases where one person tells me a narrative, a different person tells me a different narrative, but also makes me promise not to share that narrative with anyone because it will upset other community members because the first narrative was a little more flattering and the second one was a little more critical of them. So he made me promise never to tell the second narrative until a few days later. I was with him and we met a 85, 90-year-old speaker from the community who then said the less flattering other narrative. And then the first person who talked to me said, okay, now you can share that because he is a respected community member. And if it's coming from him, no one's going to be upset. Where if it's coming from me, people are going to be really mad, right? I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this kind of situation. You should generally be able to give credit to the consultants, to the speakers that you have, unless they don't want you to, right? So you do need to ask people, can I share your name in the publication so that you can have credit? And they might say, no, don't do that. I don't want anyone to know I was involved because then people will be upset with me. For these kinds of narratives, you can also ask that question. Hey, do you mind if I share this in my paper? If I do, should I credit you or would you like it to be anonymous? And give them that sort of power in the relationship. There is the problem that once it's published, you can't undo it, right? Published is forever in a way. But yeah, so you might want to present both narratives, but you might also want to consult some of the community members and be like, hey, what do you think about this? Especially if you have someone in the community that you really trust, right? Or you just present both narratives anonymously and you say, look, these are contradictory narratives. I don't know which one of these is true. Maybe neither of them is true, but anyway, this is what the tradition holds. And then that in itself, just reporting what the tradition is also really valuable. There's a lot of value in presenting tradition, even if you're not coming down on one side or another about that tradition. You kind of, yeah. So I'm sorry that the answer is you sort of have to figure it out, but you have to figure it out based on your relationship with the community and based on what you think reactions of different people in the community are going to be. It's a little bit sticky. My default would be share both, but do them both anonymously and then just say outright, there are contradictory narratives.
Okay, on behalf of the audience, I thought this question might have the audience. So kindly, sure. There's a question there. Kindly, address to this chat. I'll come later on when there is no question.
You want me to do the one in chat? Yeah.
First,
words or phrases, types of words or phrases to be avoided in academic writing. This is a little tricky too. So my bachelor's and my first master's were in philosophy, which loves really long words and complicated text. And it's really sort of like, it's kind of frustrating to read. And linguistics tends to be a lot more casual. Probably less casual than I tend to write. I think I'm probably too casual in the way that I present myself in writing, but one of the issues that you have to figure out, and this is why I say you should look at recent publications about the language that you're working on, that's my Be Current maxim, is to see how other people are doing it. And the best way that you can determine if words are good words to be using or not is to see if other people in international academia are using them. There are going to be a lot of things that you might use a word and actually it has some kind of super specialized meaning that you're not aware of. This just happens and it's not really something you should worry about. To give an example, I'll just type these in chat in case they don't come out really clear. I do a lot of stuff with tone in language. And so we have these words tune, T-U-N-E, tone, T-O-N-E, and pitch. These all have very specific meanings within the study of linguistic tone. And so a lot of times, if I get asked to review a paper on tone, which happens quite often, I end up having to correct some of these. That's fine. I'm not upset with the author, but if the author is using the wrong word, then I just leave a comment and I say, hey, by the way, you should actually use this other word because it has a specific meaning in this specific specialty. If it's something like they use a word that I think is just incredibly outdated, your reviewer is just going to tell you. So what you hope for is a reviewer who has a good grasp on the language of academic publishing in the first place, and who truly is a specialist on the topic you are writing about. Depending on what that topic is, that can get kind of messy. It can be kind of hard to find perfect reviewers, things like this. We've run into this as well in the journals that I've worked on, but generally your reviewer is going to point you to a lot of that stuff. What you can do ahead of time, though, is just look at other papers, recent papers in LTBA, Himalayan Linguistics, LDNC, other international journals that look at this part of the world, see how they're describing the same features, and then follow that. I do this as well, actually. So I will, if I'm writing a paper on, I don't know, some sort of syntactical construction in the languages I work on, I will go look at papers by people like Linda Connorth or Pavel Ozerov or other people who have published a lot and done really good work in the area who've worked on that feature. And then I follow the same kind of vocabulary that they're using in their own papers. Because it's not my expertise, right? I have the information, I know about the language, but I don't know exactly the right phrasing. So I look at other people's papers and I sort of see how are they phrasing it? What are they calling things? How are they describing this feature? And then I try to follow that. And I think that's a really good idea. And I want to make really clear, it's not plagiarizing. You're not copying, right, their sentences, but you can see what kind of vocabulary they're using to describe things. Please don't plagiarize. Please don't ever plagiarize. Your paper will get rejected. It'll be a big issue, but definitely you can look at how other people are phrasing things. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, audience, please ask questions. Audience, do you have some?
Sir, may I?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Kellen, thank you very much. This may not be very relevant for your topic, but as you are mentioning about the plagiarism as well. So I just want to know the difference between the similarity and the plagiarism. These are the two very things that confuse many of the scholars as well when they write something. Yeah, similarity and the plagiarism. This is one thing that like viewers. And the second is something like if we give a proper citation of the source material, then if we quote the whole sentence or the phrase, some people said that this is not a plagiarism if we are giving a proper citation. What do you stand on this?
Yeah, so I'm going to use real world examples. I think many people here may be familiar with Professor Stephen Morey. He was my PhD advisor. We work on a lot of the same languages. We collaborate on a lot of the same stuff, but we have also independently come to the same conclusions about certain linguistic things. One of the things that I do before I publish a paper on a certain topic is I reach out to Stephen, because I talk to him anyway pretty often, like every couple of weeks, but I reach out to Stephen and I say, hey, I have this paper that I'm going to submit. Here's what it is. He can't be a reviewer anyway, because it has to be anonymous. So if he did end up as the reviewer, he would immediately say, oh, this is Kellen. I can identify him based on the topic. Therefore, somebody else has to review it, right? And reviewers will do that. If I get your paper and I know who you are, really good chance that I'm going to make them pick a different reviewer for that reason. But I'll reach out to him and I'll say, I've come up with this thing. Have you already published this same conclusion somewhere? Because if so, then I want to make sure I'm citing you, so it's not that I'm stealing your ideas, right? And hopefully everyone else who is working on your same language or general area, hopefully you have enough of a relationship with that you can reach out to them about that stuff. The other thing is, if you come up with something that someone else has said in a paper, you really should cite them, right? So there are 4 tones in the languages that I work on. I have experimentally verified this to an extreme degree. My PhD dissertation was on this topic. I will still cite something Stephen Morey wrote in 2012 or something like that, where he makes that claim because his was the first paper that gave that number, kind of thing, right? If I'm ever writing about, Koibu Uipo, people who've already written about that are getting a citation, right? Like, because it doesn't matter whether I'm agreeing or not with them, it's still something that you have to cite there, because it really does matter that the editors and the readers believe that you are acting in good faith. It has happened that I independently came up with what I thought was a brilliant idea in my dissertation, and one of my reviewers said, well, this Chinese paper from 2002 already said exactly that. And I didn't realize that because I'd misread the original paper, right? So the reviewers are going to help you with that sort of stuff. The difference between similarity and plagiarism is it's not that unclear? And by that, what I mean is you can say something that other people have already said and not cite it if it has become general knowledge. I might tell you that Swiss German is a Germanic language. I don't necessarily have to cite anything for that because that is something that for people who work on these languages, it is so clearly known, right? But if I'm going to say something particular about a specific experimental study of the phonology of Swiss German, I really better cite that thing directly. Otherwise, that comes off as plagiarism, right? I have seen people completely copy entire papers word for word published by somebody else a few years ago, and they then just republish them in some local journal. It is obviously plagiarism in that case because anybody looking at that situation would know that they are acting in bad faith, right? They're not just being ignorant because they're literally copying paragraph by paragraph. If you have a full sentence that you think is phrased better than how you could rephrase it, then just have the whole sentence, but put it in quotes, put the citation. I do this a fair bit. Every once in a while, I'll cite somebody like Mark Post or Stephen Morey or Yankee Modi or any of these other people who sort of have been working in the area for quite a while because they've already put the sentence perfectly and I cannot improve on the wording. So I will just put it in quotes and give a citation and move on, right? Everybody likes to see their stuff cited as well. So you're also going to win points with whoever that is. Not that it's about winning and losing points, but you know my idea, right? So better safe than sorry, I guess, is the final point.
Okay, if you still have question, we may take one or two per question last in case any audience have any question.
If you're not sure about the plagiarism, ask your editor. Let me add that.
So I hope there are no more questions. So I have two quick questions. I'll put
please
together. One is citation. So assuming that you're working on a language and prior to your working, there was only one author who has worked on that language.
Yes.
And in every part of your description somewhere, there is a need to either refer to him, cite him, but this would appear so what you call it, repetitive in many times. And so it may look at the entire write up in a bad shape. Okay.
I see.
So
how
do you overcome that? And second is what is your preference between writing a paper or whatever book in a prose style versus, as you put it rightly, that if you're working on syntactic structure, there are some words or construction, appropriate vocabulary genres that you use. So how are these prose version and linguistic structure applying in different areas of academic works?
Right. Hopefully I can keep both of them in my head long enough. The first question. So if there's, audible. Can you hear me?
Please, yeah.
How about now? Is it okay?
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay. For the first question, if there's only ever been one person who's written about it, then chances are the first big paper that you write on this language, you're going to give a 3-4 paragraph summary of what their findings were. Or if you disagree with their findings, then on the subject, maybe let's say maybe they say that there are like derivational morphology, they have found 3 prefixes in the language. You don't have to necessarily say what they found in your overall summary of what they said, but later in your own section where you talk about the prefixes in the derivational morphology, you can say, unlike so-and-so who found only 3, I found that actually there's 4 because these 2 are just homophonous or whatever, right? So you can give a general summary of the things that they've said that you are not going to later directly contradict or agree with. And then later in the paper, you can touch on the other things. And that way you're not having to cite their paper every sentence, right? It's really handy in those cases, especially when there's only 1 or 2, or if you're writing a literature review section for a thesis, for example, you really can just give kind of broad summaries with the citation. And then later, if there are specific reasons you need to go back to that, then you can cite again, right? Sometimes it involves kind of shifting sentences around so that all of the stuff they say is kind of together so you can cite it once. Sometimes you just end up with a lot of citations, especially if you're jumping back and forth between different authors, right? You might have to be like citing one of them, Sharma, Smith, like this back and forth. It gets a little frustrating to write, but it's not so bad to read in these cases. The second question was, sorry, can you repeat the second question? So it was about whether prose versus.
The pure linguistic structure. When we write a paper,
yeah.
So if I'm writing a anthropological linguistic paper, so
yeah.
I might like to use a pro style version, pro version kind of description.
Sure. Right. Okay.
Yeah. And then for a syntactic paper, you may stick to syntactic structure. So what are the experiences that you can share for the benefit of the audience?
I think the appropriateness of one over the other really depends on how much you're giving at one time, but also the kind of paper. So for example, if I'm writing a paper on historical phonology, I could give a list of a whole bunch of sound change rules from the proto-language to the modern language, for example. But it may be the case that I actually have a paragraph describing some underlying principle. And then in that paragraph, in the text directly, I can give the sound change formula, right? The sort of this becomes this in this environment kind of rule. It really sort of depends on how you want to present it. And everybody probably does have a slightly different writing style. I know that if I saw one of my own papers and I had amnesia about writing that paper, I could still probably identify that I wrote it because I think I have a particular writing style. I don't particularly like the style, but I can identify the way that I write things. I think it really depends on the kind of paper you're writing, and it depends on the audience you're trying to do. I'm currently working on a paper that is going to be much more kind of general audience and not linguistic specialist. So in this case, it's much more prose explanation stuff. Whereas if I'm writing a paper that is strictly syntax, it's going to be a lot of examples, right? So I think a lot of this you just have to kind of adapt depending on the audience, depending on the topic, and depending on what the important parts of what you're presenting are. That's probably not a very satisfying answer, but unfortunately that is my answer.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. So I still welcome one more questions because I have been asking questions just to fill in the gaps. I don't want gaps. So just to fill in the gaps, I was asking in case audience want to ask a very, very pertinent question, I'll give one more question. Then the rest I'll give it to the secretary for the rest of the program. Yeah. It seems there is no question because we have been waiting for a few seconds. So Monali, please kindly take over. So I thank you so much, Kellen, again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Flouting for chairing the session and for being a part of the discussion and monitoring the session. I apologize on behalf of Tiblane for not being able to introduce our speaker well at the beginning of the session because we were running several minutes late due to the technical defect. So since we have at least some time now, so with your due permission, Kellen, I would like to introduce now. So, okay, so everybody may not know him. There are very young scholars also here. So which is why I thought that I should introduce you here. So Kellen Parker Windham is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Comparative Linguistics at the University of Zurich, as well as an honorary in the Department of Languages and Linguistics at La Trobe University, and affiliated with La Trobe Center for Research on Language Diversity. His work is primarily on Sinitic and underdocumented Tibeto-Burman varieties, especially the Central Sal varieties under those languages under Tangsa and Nokte. And he focuses on historical phonology and tonology. He has done his PhD on the topic, the tone system of Tangsa Nokte and related Northern Naga varieties under the supervision of the advisors Dr. Stephen Murray and Dr. Maria Tabine in 2018. He completed his master's thesis on a preliminary description of the historical development of modern Northern Wu dialects in 2014 at the Institute of Linguistics at National Tsinghua University under Dr. Chang Kwang Yu. He has also done several publications, and the most recent publications are in NAILS 11 to 2021, which is a diagnostic feature list for classification of varieties within Tangsa Nocte. In LTBA in 2020, the syntax of intensifiers in Mushang, and also on the Tangsa Nocte continuum in LEPHR. He has also delivered several talks in the recent years and has been teaching at his university on historical linguistics, anthropolinguistics, semantics, and several related branches of linguistics. He has also done several digital projects, such as, I hope I pronounce it correctly, Boam Thuis Jung Moishang Dictionary, which is still ongoing. And it's a collaborative dictionary project with Mosang speaker from Arunachal Pradesh. And he has worked on Icho dictionary development software, Taipake dictionary, Singpo mobile phone dictionary. Also, he has worked on Tangsa Nocte linguistic database. He's also a creator and co-founder and creator of Phonemica with Steve Hansen. And it is an online platform for crowdsourced dialect and oral history preservation, focusing primarily on minority languages in and around China. And he is very much associated with Tiblane in recent times. So we are very grateful that you have been able to give time for us today with this talk. And I also had a question, actually. So since I think I have some minutes left to finish, so I can also ask a question. I was
Please.
observing, when, my students, when they write their dissertation, of course, it's quite annoying sometimes that, they ignore and neglect the recent works, and they will cite only those works which are cited, or oversighted a lot of time. So, and I tell them, these are the works that have been published or that have been, presented, or these are the works that have been going on. You cite them, read them, and then they tell me that, okay, ma'am, we will do it. But then again, they don't cite the recent sources, or, when it comes to younger linguists who work, and sometimes they don't cite their work, thinking that, there's some kind of a mentality that, scholars from our region have, that only the works of professors are good enough to cite. So they kind of, optionalize, and this creates, a lot of pitfalls in their research, because there are many questions that they're not able to answer because of the recent findings not being, mentioned in their work. So it's very challenging for us. So how do you deal with this situation?
That's a really good question. Sometimes it can feel like a full-time job to keep up with all of the latest research on a certain topic, as I'm sure many people here know. I don't have an answer to the question of only prioritizing professors' works. I think that may be a cultural thing. It's not something I've run into with my own students here in Switzerland. Most of my students are Swiss, but also some are Italian, some are American, some are from other countries, including China. And it's not really something that I felt like, well, maybe a little bit in Taiwan, this was something that happened as well, prioritizing professors. I think probably the biggest thing there is just that maybe the best way that we can, as teachers, address this issue is us citing people who might not be professors themselves, and really kind of fronting a lot of the community-driven work that's been going on for years now in the Northeast, in the classroom with students, things like this. So I personally try to always give examples to my students in the writing class. When I'm giving examples, I try to give examples that are from people who at the time were themselves students at this university, so that they can see, oh, this person who is now some professor in Singapore or whatever, they were also at one point a graduate student here in this class right now, right? Not with me as a teacher, because I'm not that old, but and so maybe the real only solution there is for us to kind of front those things as well. This gets more difficult though, because as I mentioned, as I'm sure you know, the standards of academic publishing for a lot of journals about the Northeast really has sort of gotten a little stricter in the past years. And so if you really want to be able to give really good citations, maybe some of the better citations, or sorry, not maybe some of the better citations, but maybe some of the citations on the languages of the area might be 8 years old and not so good or something, right? And that's sort of a different issue, and that's kind of harder to fix. But yeah, I really would just try to encourage them to cast a very wide net and look for anything that is relevant to your paper. Because also, if you send a paper to me as a reviewer, and I see that they have failed to address, Guillaume Jacques' most recent whatever about this topic, then I'm going to say, hey, why haven't you addressed this? You need to address this, right? Because this really is where the field is right now. If it's a descriptive paper and they're talking about a language where, I'm not sure if you're familiar, there's a guy, Kamalesh Dasgupta, who in the 1980s published early 1980s published books on like Tangsa, Nukte, and Wancho, and all these languages in that area. For a while, his were the only books you could get on this stuff. They're not great. They're really superficial. I still need to see those cited to prove to me as an author, to prove to me that you have done your due diligence to find as much information as you can about the thing you're publishing. Yeah, I'm not sure what we can do other than actively push them to be more inclusive in their citations. That's a difficult question. I'm gonna have to think about that.
Thank you so much for kind of, empathizing with us because we come in the same situation, and this is a challenge that we face every day. Yes, thank you so much.
I will tell you, other than this one specific issue, the situation in Switzerland and Australia is not that different than the situation in India. It's really not. And as far as like major universities in Delhi or in Canberra or in Bern overtaking a lot of work that's been happening, that's a global issue that everybody's sort of facing. So yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kellen, for such a wonderful talk. And we have been so much enriched with this discussion session. So I would like to request Dr. Vijan to kindly give vote of thanks. And if you have any more words to say beyond that, you can.
Okay, thank you, Monali. Before I propose a vote of thanks, I would like to request all the participants to kindly turn on your video so that we can take one group photograph for the first day. Maybe some of our participants may not be in a position to turn on your videos.
Please turn your cameras on.
Yeah.
It's only for those.
Please turn on your All right. Then once more. Okay, thank you very much. Yes. This was a really wonderful and enriching session that we had today as the first day of this 3-day online workshop on academic writing. So at the first place, we are very happy and we are very grateful to Dr. Kellen Parker for accepting our invitation to give this talk. And we really enjoyed. I think the rest of our participants also enjoyed, and they're enlightened from your talk. And from the Grecian Maxim, for me personally, I enjoyed, and it was very enriching from the Van Damme's Maxim. So we'll try to incorporate in our future writing as well the Van Damme's Maxims. That's very interesting, and that's very fascinated to me as well. So, and I would like to thank Dr. Pauthang Haukif for chairing today's session very smoothly and monitoring the session as well. And the same to my co-coordinator, Dr. Monali Longmalai, for everything. And to all the participants who have made their time convenient to participate in today's session. And we look forward all you that you will be participating in the rest of the session, that is tomorrow and on Monday. So I think with this note, I would like to thank all of you and have a good evening to all, and yes, to Kellen Parker, and good night to here in our Indian friends. So thank you very much once again, and we look forward all your presence in the rest of the days as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening and good night. See you tomorrow.